part of the theme of my talk is thinking about what is canonical, or our idea of the canonical, and who that represents. And that's why I've included pictures in my slides. So a couple of questions which I invite you to reflect on, which I invite my students in a course on law, justice, and education to reflect on, is how do you want your education to form you? And the other is, which works do you think belong in the canon of legal studies in Canada? So kind of my goal of today's presentation is to sort of explore some of the relationships between these two questions and hopefully contribute to a broader discussion at the end. So why the idea of a canon? Well, it actually, this past summer when we were putting together the conference, I was also thinking about this new Foundations in Legal Studies course that I was going to be teaching in January, and I thought, this is great. I'll come up with an abstract, which will force me to write a paper, which will help me to, come up with a good choice of readings and justified decisions. So, of course, the paper isn't quite a paper yet. But the reason why I was reflecting on the canon is because thinking about, well, students who are in first year of university taking a Foundations Legal Studies course, what should they read, right? What are the texts that they must read, or that we're trying to provide a foundation in? And so you can think of that as a question that within a legal studies program that you confront, but also there's many law faculties that have foundations course. And when it comes to a specific area of law, like contracts, for example, or torts, or constitutional law, it might be easier to kind of focus around the canonical texts. And in fact, there's a book which I'm going to discuss later, which I learned about by reading David's PhD, after I got to page 10 and finished the title. It's called The Canon of American Legal Thought. And what the authors of that book, Kennedy and Fisher, say is that, well, there's kind of three different ways of thinking about a canon. And he said, you could think of the canon in terms of what are the canonical texts for demonstrating the substance of the law, right? So that is, like the great works on contracts or torts. And they say, well, that's not what we're interested in this project. And nor are we interested in the canonical writings on the substance of law, of what is law. So it's not a canon of jurisprudence or legal theory. It's a canon of the way that lawyers reason, how to think like a lawyer. So that's what their book is, and I'll show you what they come up with as the 10 canonical texts. But this idea of a canon, right, it has a certain resonance with scholars and people studying syllabi and just people who are thinking in the world and want to educate themselves. But then it, of course, has a particular resonance for those interested in law because, the notion of the canonical, which, the religious imagery of the 10 Commandments, and that these are the laws. This is what's authoritative. And so it can be a general rule, law, principles, but also just a criterion by which something is judged. It can be a collection or list of sacred books accepted as genuine, an accepted or sanctioned body of related work, or really just this kind of more kind of generic notion of some basis of justification, right? I'd like you to read this. This actually happened in this class this past week. So I got this email, and this is copy and pasted. And the thing is, there is no such sign on this door. And I actually looked up, and there's no canonical statement of what you're allowed to do or not do when it comes to in classrooms, with eating at UIT. So, here is a canonical expression of normativity around eating in class, right? No food, drink, cell phone. So without that, how do you address this issue, right? So how did I deal with it as a practical problem? Well, I put it on my students. They do with all these questions that I face, right? So I presented this to my students, and it gets into an interesting discussion, right? Because, is it about coming up with a sort of canonical formulation of the rules? Well, you can do that, but some people who weren't even thinking about eating before in class now, they want to say, well, what's this guy telling me what I can and cannot eat? Especially if you've got a 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. class, and people are hungry. And we ended up having this really generative discussion about all of the different rationales for the rule and exceptions to the rule, and what are the effects of formulating it, and what would it mean to the dynamic of the relationship within the class for me to come down with a rule like that, and what basis would I have, given that there isn't a wider policy, So all of these things came out. I thought, this is great, right? And like we talked about the idea, well, this whole consultation, this whole conversation, this is in itself constructing normativity. Because now that we sort of have a better understanding that, well, some people are really hungry and they don't have food, so when you bring in your chicken pot pie and start eating it and the steam's coming off, it's just kind of, not considerate, right? And so this whole notion of normative dialogue is a way that we all kind of learn about how not to be a jerk. I thought, this is fantastic. So of course we go out to the break and we come back and somebody brings in pizza and is munching. Like, it's just, I don't know, like, right? Like, what do you do? It's like, we need a rule. And there's this tension. So, about the fact that on the one hand, we, and this is the theme in David's work too, that the canonical is something we can recoil against. Because, for example, the canonical statement of UIT's mission, so this is what this place is about. It's to provide career-oriented university programs and to provide those who aren't yet in university with a chance to get a degree. So it's about jobs and pieces of paper, right? And this is in the statute, the originating statute of the university. So this is the canonical expression of, the kind of linchpin of UIT's normativity. And yet, as you know, from having been here now for your second day, that this is not at all reflective of what we understand ourselves as doing here and what we invite students into. And it's not, we talked about this last class, it doesn't gel with their experience either. And so it's a great saving grace that the canonical isn't necessarily, right, the law in the books is not always the law in action, but that can be a frustration too, right, especially when somebody, has that big veal sandwich and they're, smacking their lips. So this is a tension that we experience, and I think it's it's the kind of tension I want to draw your attention to. And so there's a theme within, Duncan Kennedy's classic piece on legal education as training for hierarchy, a recent article by Hadia Roderick, who called Black on Bay Street, which was published in the Globe and Mail, and this idea that how is your legal education forming you? Well, it's forming you to fit into this prefabricated hierarchy, right? You're becoming the cog in the wheel, and we're familiar with that. And there's this is a line from W. Du Bois, The Talented Tenth, which we can, again, he would fit pretty good on a panel, on a mantle, with the gendered language. But this notion that, well, the purpose of true education is never just strictly training. That the training is actually part of this endeavor to become who we are, right? What does it mean to be human? And Marilyn Robinson wrote a piece in the New York Review of Books last year where she was saying, like, that's a really important question. Like, that the asking and exploration of that question has a self-evident value. Why do we spend so much time trying to justify what we're doing through an economic metric? And asking these big questions, providing students with the tools to ask these big questions, I mean, that's the work of education. And that's her theory of that she sees it part of this wider utilitarian hostility to what she describes as the kind of foundations of the humanities, and that is the experience of beauty, the capacity to express one's thoughts eloquently, to be capable of a certain depth of thought. And these things, of course, there's a richness that not only transcends our institutions of formal education, but sometimes those institutions can actively undermine or deprive us or suffocate us from experiencing these things. And so it's interesting because, you say, well, what's the value of a liberal education? What's the value of a legal education? You say, oh, wrong question. Like, there is no value, right? Like, or at least there's no instrumental value. But that's not entirely true either. We're back to this tension between the kind of how we understand, the canonical. And there's quite a statement about the instrumental value which Northrop Frye expressed, where he said that the aim of education is to make people maladjusted, to destroy their notions that what society does make sense and that they have only to conform it, and that all you have to do is conform to it to make sense of your own life, right? That if Hadia Roderick had just stuck it out, right? And if you can be that little cog in the wheel, then that's where you find your purpose, that's where you find your meaning. And Northrop Frye says, well, if it's education, then it's precisely to make you uncomfortable with that. And Interesting. I came across this quote some years ago. There's a history that Mark Walters wrote about the foundation of the Queen's Faculty of Law. And there's a guy named Bill Letterman who was their first official dean. And in response to this question of, like, well, you know, the practice theory thing of, like, why are you spending time on engaging people in these mental exercises? And what you need is skills. They need to be useful. And he's like, well, there's nothing. We're talking practice theory. There's nothing more practical than the capacity to think, right? And that, so there is, you know, you can, again, it's a question of the lens that you take. And so now kind of returning to, or thinking about, okay, well, what do you get people to read, right? If, you know, part of the educational process is assigning readings and trying to expose students to different texts, well, you know, Harold Bloom in 1994, right, it's a sort of part of the American Cultures War, and said, this is what you need for an education in the humanities, right? This is what you read, and you'll notice that there's certain similarities amongst a lot of these, you know, individuals in all sort of European languages, and but the challenge, right, that he, like, so the reason why I got thinking about literature canon is, like, there is this challenge, like, you got to choose, right? There's so much out there, but of course the formulation that Bloom has, it's not just a simple question of practicality. There's also this thing where he's resisting what he calls the politics of multiculturalism, right? So you notice that, you know, he says originally the canon meant the choice of books in our teaching institutions, and despite the recent politics of multiculturalism, the canon's true question remains: what shall the individual who still desires to read attempt to read this late in history? You know, to give you a sort of indication of kind of the sort of underlying assumptions around the value of literary education that he has, you know, that quote's pretty good, right? That, you know, art is perfectly useless, and that, you know, let's face up to the fact it's an elitist phenomenon, and that way we can ensure that we do it well, and we don't want to, right? So that the canon becomes this proxy or this way of defining what is extraneous and impure, right? And the power of proclaiming the canon is, it's not as much about the specific texts that get included. By saying that there's a canon, you imply that you know what's in it, and that you have the expertise to actually define the parameters of what is considered knowledge in that area. And we do that every time we set a syllabus in some respect, right? I mean, and so that's the tension that I'm trying to get to, is that how do you present some kinds of baselines for yourself and for your students, but at the same time encourage them to see them as revisable and as not necessarily just this thing they've got to measure up against, otherwise they're dumb, or otherwise they're uneducated, or otherwise they're uninformed. So I discussed you know, these kind of, and I mean, it's interesting, right? Like their contribution, it's interesting, but in legal studies, you know, this can be one dimension of it, but, like, why would we use the appellate judge, which is the basis of the think like a lawyer phenomenon, for a deeper understanding of the subject of law? And luckily, you know, I mean, I know, you know, there's that old fierce debate, and that in law faculties there's a lot more pressure too, but here we don't have that same pressure, and we can think about how, you know, the canon could, or when we're imagining what the subject is that the canon's serving for, encompass all three of these ideas or conceptions of what we mean when we talk about legal thought, and think about, so then what they're talking about in terms of the canon is the 10 books they come up with, or the 10 articles, are these moments of methodological innovation which have left lasting traces in the legal reasoning practice of American lawyers and judges. So they see the 20th century of American legal thought, where you've got you know, Oliver Wendell Holmes coming out and challenging the classical legal thought of the 19th century, and Hoffeld coming in and trying to correct, you know, through a more kind of realist perspective, some of these assumptions about, well, if you've got it right, then you've, you know, formally got it right, and that's the end of it. You don't have to look at, well, its enforceability and stuff. And then this, you know, continues where people are challenging and correcting the analytical weaknesses of their predecessors. But it's almost like levels of sediment, because we know that, you know, classical legal thought still has resonance to a group of people trying to figure out, you know, how do we attend to the person who's annoyed that somebody's eating, and someone else who wants to have their chips and feels it's their darn right to have the chips because there's nothing that says that they don't have that right. So I guess to come back to those two questions, right? How do you want your education to form you? Which works do you think belong in the canon of legal studies? I ask my students these questions. And so on Wednesday, I asked my students, well, if we think about the canon as works that have shifted or informed your understanding in remarkable ways, what would you consider the canon of legal studies? Or what works would you include? And not a lot of students raised their hands. And I think part of that, apart from my overbearing nature, which tends to have that effect, is that we too often, especially as undergraduate students, but I mean this goes to high school, is that we're not even thinking that the books that we're being introduced to matter most insofar as they matter to us. Right? Like we think of, oh, these are the assigned readings, or these are the things that we have to satisfy, as opposed to the, how do you encouraging people to be reflecting on, wow, like what is it about this that is grabbing me and is shaping me and challenging me? But there were two answers that were, really, really interesting. And one student talked about the letter from Birmingham jail, which by Martin Luther King Jr. And he said, I had, apart from the sort of beauty of the writing, that he had never heard the natural law conception articulated in such a way. And it's interesting, because I've had this student in my class, I know him, Patrick, and I don't think he takes a natural law approach, right? But he's saying that this is something that he now has to kind of struggle with, and that it's with him. And another student, Naveed, talked about reading in one of my colleagues' courses, John Burroughs' Recovering Canada. And that he really had this sort of sense going into the course, like, we can't fix the problems of the past. Why can't people just move on, right? Why can't the indigenous people just move on? He practically reproduced the quote from Burroughs that it had such an effect on him, and I can't do that. But it was a quote about basically, well, something bad happens to you or your family, and you hear from others saying, well, come on now, Naveed, it's in the past. Like, is that the kind of world that you would want to live in? And he said, I hadn't thought about it in that way. And so the question of what are the great works that resonate with you has to do with your conception of who you are and what you're trying to experience through your own education. So in querying the canon, I was thinking, well, to what extent is the canon, if we think about the canon, we think about it like you would maybe your own life. Because there's all these paradoxes. On the one hand, like me, the canon seems so necessary. I mean, how could I imagine a world without me, right? And I wouldn't want to. But at the same time, I have to acknowledge that I am contingent, right? The second thing is to think about how, as much as we have this sort of fondness or nostalgia for this, tradition and constancy, we know that tradition itself, by its very nature, is inconstant, right? That tradition is almost a metaphor through which we try to understand the constancy of change. And finally, that the canon, or the items in the canon, like each of us, is replaceable. Because we're all going to shuffle off the mortal coil, right? Within literary studies program stuff, there's still an idea that with certain authoritative texts, but they're not necessarily always the same as they are from decade to decade, or department to department, and certainly not from course to course. But I think it's important to recognize, and why I don't totally dispense with the notion of the canon, is that even though we might be replaceable, we're not replicable. There is a uniqueness to each person, and there's a uniqueness to the achievement of any one of these texts where someone has really grappled with these questions. And so it's our gift to be able to grab onto it and try and get a grasp of ourselves. So thanks.